Step 3. Turn your shirt inside out. So you will be looking at the wrong side. You'll be able to see your seam allowances. And then your prepared sleeve, that the underarm seam and the hem are sewn, is right side out. Then you're going to put this sleeve inside of the shirt, lining up the armhole like this. And you have right sides together. It's hard to tell on my shirt because I'm using seersucker. And you're going to align the shirt. First you line up the underarm seam, and you want to be very carefully line up that seam and pin it, because that is one thing that I will grade on, that those underarm seams are lined up. So you pin that. Then you come and you line up your notches. So this is how you know if you have your shirt in the correct side, where you line up the back notches. Here's my double notch. It lines up. You can line up the front notches, and then you're going to pin around the circle. Now, I want to also show you another way to help with this fullness. So I've my underarm lined up, and then I'm going to take my sleeve, which is on the inside, fold it in half, and mark a pin. Put a pin in there as a marker. Then I'm going to do the same thing on the armhole of the shirt. Because this pattern is not that generous with notches. So this technique helped me when I did the other side. So here the shoulder is rolled slightly to the front, so the middle point is actually towards the back. Here I'm putting a pin in the halfway point, and now that helps me line up the middle of the sleeve and the armhole of the shirt. So now I'm taking those two pins and I'm lining that up. You want to make sure when you're pinning it, you have the raw edges exactly lined up together. And now I can stretch that out from the underarm seam to the shoulder point, which is the halfway mark, and pin the edges. So you will pin around the armhole, making sure that you're keeping these edges exactly together. Depending on how your pattern printed out, your notches may or may not exactly line up, because when I printed out my pattern, I had a issue with the borders being printed. So you're pinning this, and after you pin it, you are going to stitch this entire armhole seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So you stitch around the armhole with 1/2 inch, and start at the underarm seam when you're stitching this. And you start down here, and you're just going to keep everything nice and flat, stitch at a 1/2 inch, and then because you're stitching around a curve, you can keep turning this and work your way around the curve, making sure that the underneath edge of the fabric doesn't slip down. You can keep them lined up as you work your way around that seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then after you stitch it, you can overlock it. So here on this side, I've finished it, and you can see my finished edge. I stitched it and then I overlocked it. So I'm trimming off some of that bulk of the seam allowance. Then you turn the shirt right side out, and this is what your finished set-in sleeve will look like. You want to double check and make sure that your underarm seam lines up here. And you also want to make sure that you don't have any folds. So the seam needs to be laying completely flat. If you do get a little bunch, like sometimes you'll get a little fold, you can take a section of that out. You don't have to take everything out. And you could take part of it out, seam rip it, and then straighten it out, stitch it again, just back stitching over your previous stitching. You want to do that before you finish the edge, before you overlock it, overcast, zigzag, etc. And that is how you set in sleeves. Press everything nice and neat. The seam gets pressed down, away from the garment into the sleeve, and give it a nice press.